Hello, everybody, and welcome to this International Winter School organized by Università Yulm with the support of the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the United Nations. I just want to welcome you and thank you for joining us, and add to our program that tomorrow, at the end of the morning session, we will have a presentation of our university. So if you have any question, we will be more than happy to answer them. This morning, we will start with our international school, and we will talk about culture and behavioral change with Professor Pierluigi Sacco, who is our full professor of cultural economics and proxy to the European projects and international networks. Moreover, he's the head of the Venice office and senior advisor of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Just a quick note, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat, and we will leave a moment at the end of this session to answer them. But please keep in mind to keep some of them for our last session on Friday afternoon. That we will have a closing session where we will answer to all of your questions or topics that you are interested in. So thank you again for joining us. I leave the floor to Professor Sacco.
Thank you very much, Paola, and thank you for attending this session, this opening session of this winter school, which is co-organized, as Paola said, with the Food and Agriculture Organization on the UN. And one could ask, well, but why a session on cultural behavioral change on a winter school like this? Well, the topic is a bit odd, I admit. At the moment, it's difficult to find people who talk about topics like this. But at the same time, what I'll try to argue during this presentation is that not only this topic is highly well-grounded from the point of view of scientific research at the moment, but also from the, as we will see, from the policy side. But especially, it's a very relevant topic today to tackle challenges such as the ones that FAO typically has to deal with, like, for example, global environmental sustainability and the capacity to secure food for all. Just to make an example, one could say, well, these kind of topics are not the urgency. Generally, when we have a characterization of culture, we tend to think that culture is something that we can be really interested in once we have solved all the other problems. For example, if we reason in terms of a somehow naive notion of a Maslow pyramid of needs, where self-actualization arrives at the very top once you have solved all the more mundane and material problems of everyday life. In fact, as we will see, it's quite the contrary to an extent. Culture is really a fundamental dimension of human experience and a very basic one. And if we could say, if there is a common thread, for example, during the very long period in which Homo sapiens has walked the earth, so 50,000 years more or less, we could say, as far as we know today, that certainly culture has been from the very beginning one of the key dimensions of human experience. If culture is so important, and we will see also some evidence of why this is so, why it tends to be so neglected, why culture is not so present in the policy agendas, and so why, as it comes to behavior and all the dimensions that have to do with behavioral change, think, for example, of what's happening today during the pandemic, a situation in which really behavioral change is vital to our capacity to react to the pandemic in the best way, because it's, of course, we have the vaccines now, but without proper behavior by people, even the vaccines can be enough to counter the effects of the pandemic. So in this dramatically relevant moment in which behavioral change is really the focus of most policies in the most fields, if not all, why culture matters? This is the question that we have to tackle today. So first of all, of course, what we have to ask is what culture is. So what are we speaking about when we think of culture? So, in the broadest possible sense, culture has anything that has to do with the generation of meaning. Every time that there is something which has to do with expression, which has to do with an aesthetics, which has to do with a view of the world, which has to do with how we position ourselves in the world, all these things are clearly related to culture. And so, in the end, you can find the cultural element in practically every single nuance of human activity. But the point is that there are some forms of culture that are particularly outstanding because their main or even sole purpose is generating meaning. So clearly, there is culture in, for example, my own way of grabbing a cup of coffee, because of course I can grab a cup of coffee in many different ways. And it really depends on my attitudes that have to do with sociality. I've seen other people grabbing cups of coffee. There is one polite way of drinking it and an unpolite way, for example, and so on and so forth. And so clearly there is culture, there is self-expression, there is positioning myself in the world, even in a simple gesture like grabbing a cup of coffee. But it's completely different if I'm grabbing a cup of coffee at the coffee shop and we're just talking with friends, when hopefully that will be possible again. And I do the same thing on stage, for example, in the context of a theater play. Because in this second context, I am not simply, living my life. What I am doing is participating in a performance, which is a specialized activity whose sole purpose is to generate meaning, to generate an aesthetic from that kind of experience. So these kind of experiences are again very common in human experience, in human life. We have specialized institutions where these things take place. We have museums, we have concert halls, we have theaters, we have public spaces which host generally, again, the pandemic as an exception, but generally open air events that are attended by thousands and thousands of people. So these kind of activities tend to be considered as leisure activities. So activities that have to do with the ways in which we employ our free time, the way in which we entertain ourselves. But they are much more. So what is very important for us to understand is why they are much more and how they relate to the main policy issues that I was hinting at the beginning of this talk. Let's start from a practical observation. Culture today is gaining relevance, gaining traction, and in particular, culture not in the broad sense that I was saying, that I was mentioning at the beginning, not the cultural element in everything we do, but culture as the purposeful production of meaning, and all the activities that are related to that are increasingly present in the policy agendas. An example, a very recent one, is the launch at the European Commission level of the new European Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus, as you know, probably has been one of the key experiences in the history of the 20th century in translating the culture of design into the everyday life and practice of human societies, and really creating a new paradigm for the relationship between design and quality of living. So everything, not everything, but most of what is today modern design is in some sense a consequence of the cultural revolution of the Bauhaus. The idea of launching a new European Bauhaus for Europe is convening all the experts in design disciplines, so from architecture to design to multimedia design, but not only, basically all kinds of cultural professionals in all spheres, so the visual arts, the performing arts, and so on, to do what? To create a new revolutionary paradigm whose purpose is facilitating the transition of Europe towards a green society and a green economy. So, do you understand how ambitious this challenge is? And you understand that convening cultural players to do this as a flagship project of the European Commission, announced by the President of the Commission herself, is clearly a very, very strong statement that culture is important, that culture matters in such a crucial transition for the future, not only of Europe, but of the humankind. Not only, still at the European level, we have, for example, an announcement that is practically official now that the most fundamental strategic project for the European Commission in the next 7 years, the creation of the so-called KICs, knowledge and innovation communities, that are innovation communities targeting specific, highly prioritarian projects of the strategic development for Europe, and there are only 2 such projects every 7 years. Well, the first one of the 7-year cycle for development of Europe that has just begun will be about culture and creative industries. So exactly the sector that today drives the production at mass level of culture and creative contents. And if you realize that the previous areas that were considered and implemented for this particular program, the KIC program, were things like energy or urban mobility or raw materials or digital, you understand how fundamental this level is. In the moment in which Europe focuses on culture and creative industry as a strategic future lever of development, you understand that this is clearly a recognition that culture matters in a very fundamental way. So we have the new European Bauhaus, we have the KIC, we have, by the way, many other things, and we will mention them. But it's all about Europe. So could we think that it's just a European frenzy? It's just that Europeans historically are very, very, of course, concerned about culture. It's one of the identifiers of their history. So it's all about that. But what happens outside Europe? Well, outside Europe, you have the same level of excitement and mobility at the moment. You are, for example, probably witnessing how the emerging global superpowers like China, for example, are investing today in the development of their cultural sector. There are even relatively small countries, but not so small, that are becoming, for example, global cultural players like South Korea. And today, the Korean content is really becoming one of the top global trends in practically in all sectors, from music to TV series to cinema to food and so on and so forth. And you can imagine, for example, how this changes the perspective and opportunity for cultural professionals in countries like this. So it's clearly a moment in which culture is gaining traction, culture is getting the center of attention, and we have to understand why. So we start from a very simple example. And this simple example has to do with one of the defining moments of European history, which we tend to consider from a very different angle that it really should be seen from. Because when we think today, for example, of classical Greek theater in the 5th century before Christ, we tend to think that that was a moment in which this extraordinary civilization, that is ancient Greece, Athens in particular, but not only Athens, of course, were reaching an extraordinary peak of creativity that almost out of the blue gave us one of the most important phases of Western civilization. And so if you, for example, were into classical studies, probably you had to study Aeschylus or Euripides, and so these names can sound familiar or not, but there was this moment in which we witnessed this flourishing of theater festivals in small city-states that still today, thousands of years away, represent for us a milestone of European culture. You could say, okay, I mean, there have been so many interesting facts in the past human history. Why should we consider this in particular as an example that is relevant to the argument that we are trying to make now, so behavioral change? Because in the 5th century before Christ, in which the Greek theater flourished, it was not only theater that flourished. At least there was another very, very important phenomenon that emerged at the same time, and that phenomenon is democracy. So democracy as we mean it today was different from the Greek notion, the ancient Greek notion of democracy. Not everybody who we consider a citizen today, so practically every human being, was a citizen according to the standards of the 5th century before Christ. And for example, there was clearly a gender disparity. So women were basically excluded from civic life. Of course, there were free men, but also slaves, and slaves too were not particularly eligible to be considered as citizens in that kind of democracy. But the thing is that in the 5th century before Christ, we witnessed this relatively new and absolutely bewildering phenomenon of a society that in the space of one generation basically transforms itself and endowing itself with this new arenas of democratic deliberation, so collective decision making to decide what should be the future of the community, which is not based on a vertical authority, the tyrant, the king, but really becomes a process of collective deliberation, although restricted in terms of actual citizenship. How does this relate to theater? Why the explosion of Greek theater and the explosion of democracy are more or less simultaneous? Is this a coincidence, or are there other reasons that explain this? Well, the truth is that these two phenomena are deeply intertwined. What is the issue when you have a democracy? The issue is public debate. And public debate is very much about deciding what you will do under different circumstances and under different scenarios. So, parliamentary debate, it's basically a kind of what-if reasoning. For example, you have to establish a new law. And under this new law, for example, you want to fine everybody who does not pay taxes. Of course, when you debate about the merit of this, what are the natural questions that arise? What if people are not scared enough, for example, by the fine, and they continue not to pay taxes because the fine is too small? And what if we raise the fine? And what happens in that case? People could rebel against a too high fine. Or rather than levying a fine, we could send people to jail. And what kind of jail sentence should we give to people who evade taxes? So you easily understand that even the most basic questions that you can ask in a parliamentary debate easily expands into a myriad of possible conditional reasonings where you have to consider different scenarios, different possibilities, and you have to choose the best course of action, keeping in mind all the possible scenarios that can materialize. Today, for us, this kind of reasoning seems a bit natural because during our daily life, we are taking all the time decisions that have to do with this conditional scenario evaluation of possibilities. But this is not a natural attitude for humans. We had to develop it, and still we have to cultivate it to be really able to navigate complex, uncertain scenarios like the one that characterize our life today, even more, I mean, in the cases of a global crisis like the one we are witnessing today. Here comes theater. What is really interesting about theater is that theater puts you in the middle of a apparently completely fictional, arbitrary situation. But this fictional, arbitrary situation is at the same time designed to provoke in you a number of different effects, all of which have to do with this conditional scenario decision making that we were speaking about. First of all, if the play you are watching is really interesting, what is the consequence for you? You get absorbed by the play. The play really captures you. This is not incidental. As humans, we tend to have an inclination to be absorbed by stories when these stories are particularly interesting, relevant to us. What does it mean that a story is relevant? A story is not relevant because it has to do with what happens to us today. I don't need the story of my life to be absorbed of something that I see on screen or stage. Or even better, I mean, if it is the story of my life, probably it's boring because I know the story already. I need stories that seem to be remote from my experience at the moment, or even my problems at the moment in principle. But what is really interesting about these stories is that they deal with interesting dilemmas, interesting situations in which the main characters of the story really have to take decisions, really have to, for example, face adversities in certain ways. Sometimes they manage, sometimes they don't. But in any case, I mean, if they are successful or not, the kind of dilemma that they face is something that it's interesting to us. We want to know more. We want to know how it ends. For example, being told a story and not being able to understand how it ends drives us crazy. We don't want this. I mean, if I begin with a story, I want to go until the end and understand what's going on. And one could say, I mean, but look, this story is about imagined people. These people don't exist. So why should you care about this? I mean, what changes in your life if you know that this fictional character, let's say, dies or survives? The point is that we have identified with these characters. In some sense, we are those characters as soon as we are absorbed into the story. So what we should really ask is why, as humans, we tend to be absorbed and we tend to identify with characters that we know are imaginary. I mean, if you think of it, it's a completely silly situation. I mean, seen from the outside in a relatively naive way. The point is that as humans, we have learned to identify with characters when the stories are interesting, because the stories have a huge capacity to expand our experience base in dealing with situations we are not familiar with, but situations that could become relevant to us in the future. But one could say, look, wait a moment. I mean, you are telling me, you're trying to convince me that I'm watching, let's say, Alien or Jurassic Park because in the future I could be chased by dinosaurs? Are you serious? Are you kidding me? But the point is not the realism of the context. Clearly, it's unlikely that during our life we will be stranded in the outer space with an alien monster chasing us or a dinosaur. But that's not the problem. When we speak about the relevance and the realism of the story, we are not speaking about the context, otherwise science fiction would not exist. We are interested in the realism of the kind of dilemma that people are facing in that particular circumstance. The fact that I am chased by a monster, a dinosaur, or whatever is irrelevant. The problem is the fact of being chased, and of being chased in certain circumstances. So, for example, being chased in a secluded environment in which I have no escape. And this is much more realistic. Because even in my daily life today, I could have situations that metaphorically could be situations in which I am in a secluded space from which I have no escape and I'm chased and I have to find a solution. So you easily understand that things that seem to so remote, so abstract, so detached from our daily experience are the bread and butter of our experience when you see them from the right angle. So what is the implication, for example, in the case of Greek theater? In the case of Greek theater, you have a social organization that does exactly this, invites the whole community to watch a play, a series of play actually, in which apparently remote stories, for example, things that have to do with, let's say, fictional characters that have to do with the siege of Troy, or let's say capricious events driven by gods things that really seem to be literally not what happens in the real life of Athens, for example, the 5th century, but once seen from the right angle, all have to do with dilemmas that are absolutely and extremely relevant for decision making in daily life in democracy. We could even say that this familiarity of Greek audiences with theater representations that were really a institutional part of the public calendar of the city. Practically every city-state in Greece at that time had a theater festival in which several times a year, in the peak moments, you had the community convene there to watch this place day long, and in an extremely absorptive attitude that really basically stopped the public life of the city when the festival was there, because everybody was absorbed by this, even if not everybody was attending, of course. So in this particular circumstance, learning to cope with this very complex scenario setting that had to do with apparently imaginary stories created the cognitive background, the cognitive skills that enabled those very citizens in the boule, in the agora, in the places in which the public decision making was made, really literally enable them to decide with proper scenario reasoning. So the kind of skills building, capability building that was basically I think, weaved into the very logic of Greek theater was in some sense the software that made the democracy run at the same time. So there was a co-evolution between the birth and development of very complex social organizational model like a democracy, a governance model, and an apparently minor activity that was connected to leisure and free time as it was theater. Is this particular experience, Greek theater, an exception? Of course not. It's just a particularly apparent case because it's a moment of discontinuity in which we witness the birth of democracy in Western societies. And so, of course, we are particularly, also historically today, focused on a period like this. But if you really look at the moments of major change of human history, culture is always implicated. For example, we tend to think of the Industrial Revolution. And we tend to say that the Industrial Revolution is something that, of course, emerged at the end of the 18th century. And in that particular moment, what drove the revolution was, of course, the invention of technologies that, for example, created a boom in manufacturing sectors like textiles, just to make an example. But we tend to forget that the first models of assembly lines that were in some sense anticipating the full-scale industrial revolution were printed books that emerged earlier, and that were also, by the way, the cognitive base of the Industrial Revolution, because the scientific breakthroughs that enabled Industrial Revolution would have been impossible without printed books and the massive scale production of printing books. Of course, what massive meant in centuries like the 15th or 16th century, of course, it's different from what we can consider today massive production. But the fact that print emerged as a technology before the technologies that enabled the real boom of the Industrial Revolution and created the premises for that is something that is often overlooked. But again, we see an example of a situation in which we have a culturally related technology that paves the way to one of the most important breakthroughs and revolution in the human history. But think, for example, today of the new revolution that has created the new giants, for example, changing completely the idea of retail. Amazon, that, by the way, as you have probably heard, not only released yesterday their record figures for the fourth quarter of past year in terms of profits, but also gave the announcement that now Jeff Bezos will step down from the top management position at the company. Amazon, that can be considered the paradigm of this new retail, digitally driven. What was the starting activity in Amazon? Selling books. So again, we tend to think of culture as something minor in the organization of our societies, but it's practically everywhere when the major breakthroughs, the major changes are being prepared. And what is the reason then, on the basis of the examples that we make? The reason is that the experience of meaning, transforming, for example, our capacity to navigate the world, transforming our capacity to make decisions. So the importance of meaning, the importance of aesthetics from this point of view is much more profound than we tend to think. And how do we know? Well, of course we have examples, but how can we generalize? Well, it's just a matter of looking into ourselves more carefully. For example, we know today, thanks to the developments of neuroscience, we know today that culture really is an activity that makes our body resonate in ways that would not be thinkable for activities which did not have such a profound and important role in our life. Because these forms of resonance, and I will give some examples now, these forms of resonance have clearly been the outcome of a biological programming. And nature tends to be parsimonious. So if nature inserts some kind of biological programming through specific evolution that, as we know, is driven by adaptive change, the capacity to successfully react to environmental conditions, this means that clearly these particular mechanisms are very important for humans to survive and thrive in certain evolutionary environments. What kind of resonance are we speaking about? Well, one aspect has to do with, and again, this relates to democracy and social organization more generally, one aspect has to do with the role that culture has on influencing human social behavior. And so, in particular, the capacity of humans to create cohesive groups. An example, well, we have, for example, today evidence from modern social neuroscience of what happens when people watch a play all together. So let's come back to this particular example, watching a play. Thanks to the tools that are available today, and by the way, during this winter school, you will also have opportunities to hear from our wonderful group of neuroscientists at the Ulm Behavioural and Brain Lab. So look out for that. But neuroscience today has, for example, been able to measure exactly what happens in terms of bodily reaction to people when people are watching a play, for example, in terms of sweating, in terms of breath rhythm, but also in terms of heartbeat. And in particular, there was a remarkable experiment conducted by the group of Vittorio Gallese and his colleagues at the University of Parma, one of the most important research groups for neuroscience in the world, where they actually were able to measure exactly this bodily reaction of people watching a play. And the surprising, but not so surprising in the light of the previous experience, but that was really a moment in which we could see it precisely. The surprising result of this was that during the play, the heartbeat of all the people watching the play was synchronizing. So the people were literally beating at the same time in terms of their own heartbeat. And this synchronization effect remained also minutes after the end of the play. What does it mean that people synchronize their heartbeats? Clearly, there is a sort of subconscious coordination. When your heartbeats are synchronized, you literally resonate with these other people. So what is the most likely effect that comes out of that? A sense of communal feeling, the sense of being part of the group. We know today that the best way to form a group, especially in relatively quick conditions, is to make people who should be part of the group perform activities that entail coordinated movement in time. For example, dancing, for example, marching. Think, for example, of military drills. It's all about marching in time. This kind of thing that could seem ludicrous, we could say, well, that's the crazy things that military do for whatever reason. No, no, no. There is a very precise reason why they do that, why they march in time, why they stomp, so that everybody hears that all people are putting the feet on the ground at the very same moment. The reason is that this coordinated action creates, sparks, in some sense, a deeply ingrained behavioral program that we have, that if we are really moving in time with other people, these people are part of our tribe. These people are part of the group. And in particular, in the case of the military and military training, this means that if you, with these other people, will find yourself in the future in a life-threatening situation, in which your life will depend on their own choices and vice versa, you can trust that you're part of the same group. This kind of thing that seems absolutely crazy, it's so deeply ingrained that today we know from experimentation that even randomly assign people to groups and making them so without any kind of specific characteristic that determines where you're part of group A or group B, this very fact, the fact that you're part of a group, and even more if you make these people, engage these people in coordinated activities, this will create a group feeling, and people will be able, for example, to pay a cost to support people who are part of their group other than people who are not. So we are speaking on effects, of behavioral effects that are absolutely crucial, for example, from the point of view of the social organization. So the fact, for example, of singing together in a choir, or dancing together, or even watching a play that can seem absolutely negligible from the point of view, for example, of changing our capacity to tackle, let's say, environmental challenges, in fact, has an extremely powerful role. And the reason is that the more, for example, we are able to create a group feeling with people in certain circumstances, the more when we have to do with responsible behaviors, like the behaviors that, for example, are entailed in waste recycling, for example, or let's say responsible use of renewable or even more non-renewable resources, well, this really can make a difference. Whether we feel we are part of a group, whether we feel we are responsible towards the new generations or not. And the difference can be massive. And this is an example, but there are several more. For example, we know today that there is a huge relationship between even our own mental states, our mental sanity, and the capacity to access, for example, meaningful experiences. Many of you probably during this pandemic, especially if you have been locked into a situation in which you could not exit your home, or you could not see your friends regularly as you were accustomed to do, in situations like this, in which we really experiment forms of experiential and emotional deprivation. Clearly, for example, the fact of having the possibility to access meaningful experiences, like, for example, reading a book, or let's say watching a TV series, or whatever it is, made a difference for so many people. This has been a sort of natural experiment about the relevance of culture, for example, in the maintenance of our everyday equilibrium from the point of view of emotional balance and control, from the point of view of our capacity to maintain a good mood, and so on and so forth. This, again, is not a random observation. This is something that is today reflecting an extremely interesting trend in the scientific literature, a trend that has been even recognized by the World Health Organization, which at the end of last year published a scoping review that for the first time systematically covers the countless experimentations going on today in many different fields on the relationship between cultural experiences and psychological well-being and even health. And for example, what we know today is that our capacity, for example, to resonate to cultural experiences, not only for things like improving your emotional control, but for example, for slowing down your cognitive decay in situations like the Alzheimer's disease, for example, it's extremely significant. But we know today that even, let's say, you break your bone, and so you are in a situation of recovery, the speed of regrowth of your bone tissue can be influenced by the fact that you systematically listen to music, for example. The fact of being exposed to music, and especially classical music, in post-surgical conditions which are painful, this exposure to music tends to reduce the amount of opioids that you need to calm your pain, because in some sense, listening to music in certain circumstances has a similar competing effect. It reduces your feeling of pain. So you understand that literally our body has been designed to react to culture in ways that are much more profound and subtle than we tend to think. And when we simply think of culture as something that we can do in our free time, we are severely underestimating what is the actual role of culture in human life. So, what should we do about this? Well, we know that today, for example, the issue of architecture of choice and behavioral change is becoming so important because we live in a complex society, and there have been, for example, very, very important lines of research in developing new approaches, like, for example, from behavioral economics, the so-called nudging approach, to induce people to behave in certain ways or to choose in certain ways that, for example, favor not only their own personal interest, but also the public interest. Like, for example, how can we, by arranging in different ways, for example, foods in a grocery store, induce people to buy more frequently healthy foods rather than unhealthy ones. So by changing the arrangement, can I implicitly, I mean, induce people, nudge people into buying the healthier food? These kind of things, of course, have wonderful motivations. I mean, it's really made for the good of people, and in some sense for the good of society, because everybody is, of course, affected by the fact that, for example, there is an obesity epidemic out there, because it's not only coronavirus epidemics. We know that even if literally they are not epidemics, from the behavioral point of view, bad behaviors can really work like an epidemics in spreading conditions that are really harmful for our society. So one could say that's wonderful. The fact that we can manipulate people benevolently, for example, by rearranging the order of foods on grocery aisles, could be a way to, for example, improve human health. But the point is that the manipulative character of this, the fact that we are doing this behind the shoulders of people, that we are tricking with the cognitive biases and presets of people, is something that people are not always very happy with. Because in the end, you're being manipulated. It doesn't matter if you are manipulated for good reasons or bad. You could say, okay, today I'll be manipulated for good reasons, but maybe tomorrow you will manipulate me for bad reasons. So how should I trust you? So I see a slippery slope in this particular approach to choice architecture, and I'm not the only one. There is a growing sense of uneasiness and let's say concern about this idea that paternalistic benevolent manipulation could be the key of a public interest approach to societal challenges. In a sense, what culture does is the same. It has, not in the sense of manipulating, but in the sense of making you resonate and influencing your choice processes in ways that can be profoundly impactful in terms of what you choose to do. But the difference in the case of culture is that when you become aware of that, it doesn't change the capacity to modify your behavior. In the case of nudging, I have not to be aware of that, because once I am aware, in some sense, I know the trick. And so the point is, you look, they've put the oatmeal here and the chocolate chips down there. But I mean, I don't get fooled that easily. The chocolate chips I want to go for. I mean, even if the oatmeal is here, I don't really like the oatmeal. Good try, nice try, but I will not fall for that. So in this particular case, once I know the trick, there's nothing that really matters anymore to me in terms of influencing my decisions. But in the case of culture, even if I am aware of that, even if I am aware that music, for example, moves me to, let's say, control my emotional state, or that collective dance moves me to experiment a sense of a fellow feeling with people dancing with me. This does not prevent these things from affecting me exactly the same way. Not only, but I'm not manipulated because I am aware of that. And in some sense, I can make a choice, because this is really part of the behavioral programming, the behavioral conditioning that is myself. I mean, there's nothing strange that I move with my music. I am the kind of guy that is moved by music, and I don't find anything wrong with that. So the point is that we can develop a completely different approach to choice architecture and to behavioral change, in which, rather than tricking people into doing things because we have bugs in our behavioral programming, we are exploiting the good aspects of our behavioral programming, the one we are proud of, the one we identify with, to improve our capacity to be social, our capacity to be responsible, our capacity to promote our health in ways that we find rewarding. So you really see that there is a functional relationship, not an instrumental one, but it's a functional relationship between ourselves and the cultural dimension, because we are cultural beings in a much deeper sense of the word than we tend to think. From this point of view, once again, the European Commission has been the pilot, in some sense, the pioneer in experimenting a new approach to cultural policy, in which specific areas of social impact that are clearly related to behavioral change have now been put at the forefront of the probably most advanced document in cultural policy that is available at the global level, which is called the New European Agenda for Culture. In this particular document, Europe has pinpointed certain areas that in these years, I mean, starting 2021, with the new European programming, will become a focus of a targeted experimentation using European resources to develop cultural projects that can be transformational in the impact in the following areas. You will find nothing surprising given what we have discussed so far. The first area is the relationship between culture, psychological well-being, and health. The second area is the relationship between culture and social cohesion. The third area is the relationship between culture and innovation. You also have another area that is the relationship between culture and education that has already been, of course, on the table for such a long time, but it is now also seen from different angles again, especially considering the complementarity between cultural innovation and educational innovation, because today we really need also to revive the drive, the intrinsic motivation for education in people, because we are moving towards knowledge societies, and if we don't have a massive capability building, a massive flourishing, not only our knowledge society will not work, but in some sense our democracy again will be in danger, as we have seen in moments in which the basic tenets of democratic functioning have been challenged, even in major countries, even in countries whose political internal outcomes can have major consequences for the world. You understand what does it mean to have a flawed democracy, or a lack of capacity of people to participate responsibly in democratic debate. So the future of human societies is very much about a flourishing in capacity, that is educational capacity, but for the reasons that I am trying to explain, is also cultural capacity. So it's extremely important today to understand that culture is not about free time, culture is not about entertainment, culture is about human behaviors, culture is about our way of positioning ourselves in the world, and by doing this, changing the way in which we perceive our decisions, changing the ways in which we decide. A culturally deprived life, the fact that people have a few opportunities to experience meaning, aesthetic, emotion in this deep sense, is part of any meaningful notion of what poverty is. Cultural poverty is an integral part of poverty, and being culturally deprived deprives people of basic capacities to improve their life in so many different ways. So it's extremely important for us today to understand how behavioral change can, the agenda of behavioral change can be dramatically improved if we start thinking of culture positively as a platform for massive social change, for experimentation on new possibilities, not only because we have a long history that documents this kind. I could only make a very, very quick examples, of course, but there could be hundreds and hundreds of meaningful examples in this regard. By the way, from all traditions, from all histories, not only from the Western point of view, from the Eastern point of view, or from the Southern point of view, it doesn't change at all. It's really, human history is punctuated by this kind of moments in which culture reveals its relevance and impact spectacularly in terms of our capacity to function as humans and as societies. But the point is that we can invent much more. The digital revolution today is creating a new possibility for everybody to participate in the creation of content. If you think, for example, of what happened, let's say, even 1 century ago, I mean, if you wanted, you could, let's say, 1 century ago, that was just the beginning. But if you wanted, you had enough money, possibility, you could go to the cinema, or you could buy a record and play it on the phonograph. But you couldn't make your own record or make your own film yourself, because unlike a small fraction of specialists and professionals, most of the people did not have neither the skill nor the technology to do this. But today, everybody can do this. Everybody today can produce their own images and narratives and whatever kind of content in whatever form, and access very easily, for example, the digital software that is needed to cut this to professional standards. Today, if you are really motivated into it, even if you, for example, did not come from professional music studies, you can produce your own musical track, or of course your photographs, or of course your video. I mean, the new socials like TikTok are all based on this. And this is a revolution. And of course, there are critical aspects that we have to consider. But we have to consider that the fact that today everybody is becoming a creator of meaning and participating in this new arena is creating massive new possibilities, not simply from the point of view of creative expression, but from the point of view of leveraging the potential of culture for behavioral change by creating situations in which, through the production of meaning and through the access of the meaning produced by other people, we can really create new arenas, new platforms in which our sensitivity towards issues of common relevance, like, for example, global hunger, to speak of FAO, or let's say global climate change, or the migrant crisis, can be seen from completely different angles. So cultural ingenuity, cultural innovation, the capacity of use culture to really explore new possibilities and involve other people into this apparently imaginary world that, however, as we have seen, have also very, very concrete sides, can be an extremely powerful way to bring about massive social change through change of behavioral attitudes at the individual level. So I'm hopeful that the difficult moment that we are experiencing today is also a defining moment in terms of exploring these new possibilities and finally bringing culture to the top of the policy agenda. As it was mentioned at the beginning, at the moment, I am a professor at IULM University, but I am also a senior advisor at the OECD, the Organization of for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the most important global organization for policy, economic policy today. For example, I'm witnessing how, in my organization today, culture is scaling up very quickly in terms of the policy agendas globally, because governments are starting to understand that probably there is something in culture beyond what they commonly believe to be. And there is, for example, a very, very clear signals of interest from civil society, for example, in being engaged in these new kinds of conversations about innovative cultural policies, for example, bringing, for example, health issues into museums or theaters. And these kind of things are really resonating, and we will see soon governments, for example, launching bold cultural policy agendas. Some of them are already in the making. So I want to really attract your attention towards this field as an exciting field for future professional and scientific development, which will probably be extremely helpful to change your attitudes and to improve our effectiveness in tackling the global societal challenges, the bold, difficult societal challenges that we have to face today. Okay, that's basically what I wanted to say today to you. And now I am open to any kind of comment and question that can come now or in the final session on Friday. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, so the first question is, what do you think about the role of Amazon in the cultural sector? That's a good question. Thanks for asking. Clearly, it's a very complex role. I exemplified, for example, the drive that bookselling gave to Amazon to become a global, the dominator of global retail. But clearly, for example, the dominating market position of Amazon, and Amazon is just an example. I could speak of Spotify, for example. I could speak of Netflix. The fact that today we are witnessing the emergence of new cultural giants, of course, is creating also serious difficulty on the market. I think, for example, in the case of Spotify, and for very, very good reasons, musicians complain that the margins that Spotify leaves to them for the streaming of their own music are extremely tiny, and this does not allow people to survive professionally. So this means that today we are witnessing a dominance of big private interest in global market, global contents for global cultural contents markets. But this, of course, needs to be regulated. And we are at the beginning of the story, at the beginning of the cycle, and there has been a bit of naivete in giving this space, for example, unregulated space to big platforms to intermediate cultural and creative contents. But clearly, with proper regulation, I think artists and cultural producers, also in view of the importance that they have socially, should and could get a more fair share of the proceeds that enables them to live after that. So that's clearly a major issue for the future. So another question, I believe that individuals tend to have various cultural capacities. How would mass cultural policies try to handle these differences in order to make the intended impacts effectively and positively? Yes, of course, mass cultural policies, it's an issue. There are clearly certain types of policies that can be designed and implemented at the national level, but most cultural policy more comfortably sits at the regional level. For example, different regions in the same country have completely different needs and completely different cultural characteristics. So this is one of the reasons why globally, worldwide, cultural policies tend to be designed more at the regional level than on the national level, and sometimes even at community level. So we have to have a sort of multi-level level structure of cultural policy design, which is the best way to implement it. But today we have excellent examples of regional cultural policies that are really putting certain regions, on the global scene in very, very effective ways. So I urge you to focus and consider in particular this fact that there is this multi-level organization, and many of the interesting things today happen at the local level rather than at the national one. Can we expand our culture to others in order to gain more people working for us now in the pandemic? How we are going to do it? Well, it's very much about narratives. For example, the fact that there has been this proliferation of conspiracy theories, in the end, is a cultural phenomenon. QAnon, or more generally, conspiracy theories, are narratives. These are narratives that are deeply deceiving in many respects. But at the same time, these are narratives that are very effective. So what we have seen, for example, I work a lot in research in infodemics. So what kind of cultural communication phenomena today prevail in the global arena related to the pandemic? And it turns out that, for example, science has been less effective than conspirationists sometimes to create not narratives in the manipulative sense, but easily understandable and absorbing ways to look at the facts in ways that enable people to behave consequently. So, for example, clearly, if people are scared about the pandemic, they see so many different contradictory opinions and views on the same things, and some of these are simple and appealing, some of them are complicated and frightening. It's natural that people seem to, be attracted to the simple and appealing ones, even if they are false. So it's very much about taking seriously the cultural dimension of scientific communication, for example, to create a counter narrative that enables people to understand better and more effectively what to do and why in certain circumstances. So this is something which has been underdeveloped for such a long time, but in the future, for example, a wise use, a non-manipulative use of narratives for scientific communication is one of the most exciting emerging areas, for example, for cultural production. I would like to ask about the role of the digital revolution of a vulnerable is culture when everybody can create content. The fact that everybody can create content is no vulnerability at all. It's a solid. It's a matter of solidity. It solidifies our capacity to be, let's say, democratically participating in the creation of meaning. But one could say, yes, but most of what's produced online today is crap, is stupid, is unuseful. But we have to understand that we are at the very beginning. We are at the beginning of the learning curve. The digital society, as we know it, has been existing for more or less a decade now. Before, it was just a prehistory of it. So we are just making the first baby steps into it. We have to learn. We have to learn, and clearly the role of public platforms from this point of view, the role of educational systems has to be much more relevant than it is today. But we are at the beginning of the learning curve. We have to understand what are the critical lessons. We have not to be scared of the effects, because, by the way, every major cultural technology, when it was introduced, created the same kind of agony. When radio was initially introduced, when television was initially introduced, when novels were initially introduced, when print were initially introduced, there were all the grumpy people complaining about the corruption of customs all the time, in all circumstances, for all technologies. So nothing new from this point of view. We have to learn. We have to be honest with ourselves in terms of what we don't understand, what we did wrong. But the fact that everybody's participating is the very good news, and this is something that we should not renege on in any moment. Is there high value and low value culture? No. It's a matter of salience and relevance from my own point of view. There are things that I find interesting or not, things that other people may find interesting or not. We can argue about that, but it's really important that all forms of cultural expression, however uninteresting and rough they can look from our own point of view, have their own rationale and justification. If somebody has produced them, it's because they matter for somebody. For example, in the history of Europe, there is this long tradition in distinguishing between highbrow and lowbrow culture, which, by the way, is a meaningful distinction from the European point of view. And highbrow culture, as defined by Europe, of course, has been and still is extremely important in human life and human cultural history. But nevertheless, Those forms that are generally considered by expert standards as lowbrow are wonderfully complex and wonderfully interesting in their own right. And today, what we have learned is exactly this: studying different cultural universes from different perspectives, especially because what is the main consequence of everybody producing content today? That everybody is part of a subculture. So my own subculture can be different from yours, and what I do can be completely meaningless to you. But from my point of view, is highly important, and I really identify with this. So we have to learn to deal with this complex ecosystem of cultural meanings, and this is a wonderful source of richness, but at the same time requires much more flexibility. If everybody has the same culture, of course, you don't need to be flexible because everybody thinks like you. But if most people have completely different cultural universes with respect to you, you really have to be flexible all the time. But this is enormously beneficial because by being flexible, you understand, for example, how navigate the complex social environments we're living in today. And the multicultural societies we're living in are going to stay. So from this point of view, again, this is a wonderful opportunity. Hearing about cultural nudging and group thinking influencing behaviors, when we talk about sustainable choices, then how much is up to the consumers and how much is to the corporate strategy? Clearly, it is a negotiation game here. Corporate strategies, of course, follow very, very simple principles, and they generally are profit maximization, although sometimes they are glossed in different ways. But by and large, at the end of the day, it's about profit maximization. So it's unlikely that the corporate strategies themselves will be responsible in terms of pursuing goals that can be beneficial to the consumer from the consumer viewpoint. So we need to become more aware from this point of view. Clearly, the more we are aware of the consequences of certain choices, of our own choices, for example, the more we are able to negotiate on a peer-to-peer basis with not as single individuals, of course, because we are hopeless from this point of view. But if we are able to organize, if we are able to negotiate from a collective interest point of view, and this is really about, as I said before, group feeling, the capacity to organize society from this point of view, to negotiate public interest points, well, this really can make the difference. And we are seeing what's happening today also with digital platforms. With digital platforms, the fact that there is an increasing amount of users that is critical and aware of what are the consequences, for example, of being systematically profiled by platforms that send the data and information and profiling to each other. Well, what are the consequences of this? So people are raising their voice. People are starting to be willing to negotiate also from hard positions. And the consequence of this is that the states, for example, are taking a much stronger stance against these manipulative practices by private digital platforms, for example. So it's very much about that. It's very much about organizing to create a counterpoint, so to speak, to the corporate domination that is today, for example, the digital sphere. How can we help each other, all countries and people, learning about the green economy and execute it right, working right without spending money without purpose? Well, again, culture can do a lot from this point of view. I think that, for example, the digital gives today to us the capacity to really create transnational platforms, transcultural platforms. Examples like Greta are interesting because in some sense, Greta has been a cultural player. Greta had a simple vision, a simple message, but wonderfully delivered. And it was a message that basically had not to do with power. It had to do with imagination. It had to do with the right symbols used in the right way, sitting out of the parliament with your cartel. There, that's basically what she did. And have you seen what kind of impact this can have? So it's very much about collective imagination. It's very much about using, for example, the new digital means to organize mass mobilization around certain issues, but not simply calling people to action, but using the imaginative, transformative power of culture to create a common imaginary, a common language, a common vision, a common heritage of symbols, for example, to mobilize people to mass action. This is where culture can make the difference. In retrospect, especially considering the climate catastrophe, do you agree with Adorno and Horkheimer's statement that the culture industry has manipulated the mass society into passivity? No, I don't. Honestly, I don't agree with the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School, of course, saw and rightly the perils, the threats of mass culture, but at the same time, they didn't see also the powerful positive implications of this, because again, the position that philosophy, for example, took from a European standpoint in the crucial passage of the 60s, witnessing the explosion of mass culture, was that basically they didn't trust the capacity of people to choose for their own interest what kind of cultural content could be relevant. The idea was that it's the expert that has to choose for you, because the expert knows better than you what culture is good for you. Well, I am not denying the role of the experts. In some sense, I am an expert myself. I am part of the category. But what I'm saying is that we need a more democratic, more decentralized ways. And basically, popular culture has been sometimes very manipulative, but also has produced wonderful new experiences, a wonderful new heritage and literature of stories, of visual imaginations, and so on and so forth. So that kind of skepticism, I think that historically was not well justified. And what's happening today would be probably even more scary from a Frankfurt School perspective. But for the reason that I already mentioned, I think that that's not the right attitude. We really have to be open-minded towards these developments, because that's how human history has always rolled out, and we really have to understand what kind of lessons comes from there. Malcolm Gladwell cited when people are in a group, responsibility of acting is diffused. However, you mentioned responsibility is more effective when we cultivate a group feeling. How can we explain that? Well, that's a complex matter. Of course, when we go into detail, we see that the actual mechanism of group decision making change from situation to situation. For example, also what we mean by group. It's sometimes very problematic, where the group, for example, identifies people that are from, let's say, the same social background or the same ethnicity, is something. When you want to create a group that, for example, has people from different social backgrounds or different from people from different ethnicities, the mechanisms are more subtle. So the point is that some groups are more easily formed. Some groups are more difficult to form, but what we have learned from social psychology today is that even the most challenging potential groups that can be formed under certain circumstances do form. So I cannot now argue in detail about this specific Gladwell statement. There is a very, very articulate and complex literature about social incentives to group making and how culture contributes to them. But the main message is that even in the most critical cases, under the right circumstances, culture has proven to be one of the most effective channels through which groups can be formed, even between people that are generally antagonistic, for example, separated by civil wars and or long-time conflicts and so on and so forth. Could cannibalism or simpler racism be a cultural characteristic and accepted? Well, no, because that, of course, has to do with a very, very profound topic in moral philosophy, but clearly there are limits. Every form of discrimination or violence, of course, can have a cultural justification in a group, but if this group is not secluded and self-contained, and if this group interacts with people with different values, this is something that does not have to do simply with extreme cases like cannibalism or extreme violent racism, but has to do with every kind of cultural position that wants to constrain or impose certain types of costumes or actions on other people. From this point of view, clearly, there are limitations, and what we are learning today in contemporary societies is exactly how to negotiate this public space. But clearly, from this point of view, there are limitations which are not censorship to cultural expression, but are the basis for civil coexistence. So it's a very complex matter, and thanks for asking, because this is a really interesting question. But of course, there are these limitations and we need them. How do you see the future of zero carbon goal in Europe? Not only culture, but also the political economic actions, usage of coal affects Green Deal. What would we do to get balance between borders? Well, of course, again, these are huge questions, but the point is also the political consensus, because technically we know increasingly what to do. The problem is to have the political consensus to implement these changes. For example, in Europe, the political platforms are today much greener than they were, let's say, 2 decades ago. But still, compared to the United States, for example, Europeans are much more green-oriented than the Americans are, because, for example, the coal industry in the US has still a huge vested interest, as we have seen also in the political competition. So I think that, again, it's not a technical problem anymore. It's not a technological problem anymore, because we have increasingly green technologies to be implemented. It's a problem of public consensus. And from the public consensus point of view, again, the cultural element can do a lot, because the point is changing the imagination of the people, the way in which people represent the future consequences of these choices, and again, creating a powerful vision, a powerful narrative for people to visualize, to materialize what are the consequences of responsible versus unresponsible environmental choices can make a huge difference from this point of view. Okay, I think we are getting to a close. I just picked the few other questions. Thanks for this flood of very, very, very interesting questions. I would have liked to have more time to respond to all of them. But from your own point of view, how do you think agriculture promotes culture? Well, even etymologically, there are analogies, of course. Agriculture contains culture, also because culture is basically cultivation. It's a metaphor in some sense of what the agricultural process is. Well, today, for example, with the rediscovery of agriculture, return to the land, return to the environment as a way of promoting a more sustainable way of life. Agriculture, in particular rural spaces, can do a lot. I think that, for example, one of the effects of this global pandemic will be that many people will move away from cities, they are already doing, and exploit teleworking, for example, to live in rural environments. So we could even witness today a rural creative revolution, insofar as we see the movement of a large enough share of creative professionals, for example, to rural areas, to use their imagination and mental resources, for example, to change rural environments today, not because they have to be changed because they are, let's say, not beautiful or interesting in themselves, but because they have an incredible amount of untapped opportunities and potential, because, of course, living in the direct contact with nature today is even more important than in the past, especially after the hard lesson learned with this pandemic. So I think that not only there is a relationship, but the rural areas today are one of the most exciting fields for the future development of cultural innovation. Are we able to consider culture as a flexible factor that might change and reform due to different influences or reasons, such when people change and adapt to new cultures in workplace or in general? Yes. Culture, from this point of view, is a wonderful gym, so to speak. Putting ourselves in the shoes of other people, seeing things from different viewpoints, even if we maintain our own viewpoint, enriches us so much that really this improves our capacity to frame decisions in the right way, to understand the circumstances in the right way. So this incredible capacity to shift between different viewpoints and different perspectives through cultural imagination is one of the most important human abilities, and we need to promote it much more for the reasons that I explained. I would like to ask if culture can affect people's consuming behavior enormously. Consuming behaviors today are practically 100% culture. If you choose a pair of sneakers rather than another one, it's because you like the materials better, or you don't even know what kind of materials are there. What you're really interested in is the kind of identity that particular kind of sneakers project with respect to that other kind. So the first one is my tribe, the other one is another tribe. So it's very much about identity building. It's very much about expression. 95% of what we buy has not to do with survival needs, has to do with expression needs. And these expression needs are literally shaped by cultural content. So from this point of view, we also really to reimagine what consumer behavior is today. And the best way to reimagine it is to think of it in strictly cultural terms. So thank you very much. It's been exciting, really. All these questions really show that these things are, in some sense, biting in terms of what is meant, what is seen as salient today in the debate. So thank you so much for all the stimuli, and see you at the final session on Friday afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Sacco. It has been really interesting, and we had a lot of questions. So thank you very much for this very active participation this morning. If you have other questions, please send them into the international.affairs@iulm.it. You can see the address in the chat so that we can collect them and cover them at the end of this week. Now I leave you with a video of our university, and I see you at 2:30 with the session dedicated to the food ecological footprint by the FAO expert Isaac Guzman. So see you later, and thank you again.
I think my favorite part about studying at the university is the international diversity that it has. It's been a really good time this week, Welcome Week, just bonding with them and just getting to know who they are, and I'm excited to keep on learning who they are and studying.
I really like these first 2 weeks organized by ULM. These welcome days, it's really great activities to get introduced to the Italian culture, history, and to find new friends, and just to have a great start to an Italian life.
I find the city that most beautiful in the world. I've seen many places. I'm enjoying the city. I'm enjoying the food. They are lovely people. And the university, it's so good.
I've been visiting places like Duomo Square, Fashion District, and so many other places, including churches and cathedral. Beautiful. One of the most beautiful cities in the world.
I went to the Scalas. I've seen the Duomo, this castle, and the paintings of Leonardo da Vinci. Really, really impressive. And hopefully, at the end of my master's, I hope to be able to speak Italian as an additional international language.
I chose Milan because it's a very international city. It's very cosmopolitan. It's just a perfect place for young people. I chose UM because it's a perfect university for the degree. It's perfect for media and communications, languages. I love it.